From the moment he stepped onto the screen, people knew that they liked him. He'd only been there for about 40 seconds and then suddenly he was gone. A minute later, another hero appeared. Then another and another until the whole team showed up. It was like they were everywhere. Now, if you're a huge Marvel fan, you probably know that this scene happened in the first Avengers movie back in 2012. But at the time, the fact that so many superheroes could share the screen together was a big deal, because it showed the world that the Marvel Cinematic Universe was more than just a bunch of standalone superhero movies. It was one big story that kept getting bigger and bigger. In fact, between the first Avengers movie and now, the MCU has become a pop culture titan, dominating movies, streaming, games, and merchandise, even though the company behind all this awesomeness almost fell apart less than 20 years ago. So here's how Marvel went from zero to hero and ended up ruling the world. The Golden Age. Marvel's origin as Timely Comics in 1939, founded by Martin Goodman. Joe Simon later became a key figure and co-created Captain America. The first comic they ever put out featured a superhero named Human Torch and a super soldier named Captain America. These characters might sound familiar because they are still around today, but back in the 40s and 50s, Timely wasn't really on anyone's radar. Their comics were often overshadowed by the more popular superheroes from DC Comics like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. That's why the real golden age of Marvel didn't begin until the 1960s when Stan Lee took over the company. If you don't know who Stan Lee is, well, he was basically the father of Marvel. He helped create some of the most iconic superheroes of our time, including Spider-Man, Iron Man, the Hulk, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four. But even though these characters were amazing, they didn't do much for the company at first. In fact, Timely actually lost money for several years before Stan's ideas started to take off. That's because the comic industry had changed a lot since the Golden Age. Back then, comic books were seen as a fun novelty or something just for kids, but now they were a serious business. There were tons of publishers all trying to outdo each other with crazy storylines and larger-than-life characters. That's why Stan Lee came up with the Marvel method, which gave his writers and artists more freedom to explore complex themes and make their characters feel more human. For example, instead of just being a strong, silent type, Captain America was shown struggling with depression and anxiety in modern times. The X-Men weren't just mutants with cool powers, they were also teenagers dealing with high school drama and prejudice against mutants. And Spider-Man wasn't just your friendly neighborhood wall crawler. He was also a nerdy high schooler trying to balance his personal life with his superhero duties. As you can imagine, readers loved these new stories, and the comic industry had never seen anything like it. By the late 60s, Marvel was pulling in millions of dollars every year, and by the 70s, they were making more money than even DC Comics. Unfortunately, this success didn't last forever. The fall. You see, the comic book market was kind of like a roller coaster. One minute you're soaring to new heights, the next you're plummeting to the bottom. And that's exactly what happened to Marvel. In the 80s and 90s, the comic book bubble burst and the industry started to collapse. Sales dropped, competition grew, and profits vanished. And as if that wasn't bad enough, Marvel had a ton of debt. They'd spend years borrowing money to fund new projects and buy other companies, and now that they weren't making as much money, they couldn't pay back their loans. In fact, by 1996, things were so bad that Marvel had to file for bankruptcy. They were out of options and didn't know what to do next, so they made a decision that would change the company forever. Marvel decided to sell the movie rights to some of its top heroes. Spider-Man went to Sony, X-Men and Fantastic Four went to Fox. And all of this was done in an effort to save the company. At the time, they were desperate and didn't know if they would ever make it out of bankruptcy. But here's the thing, even though they lost some of their most valuable properties, Marvel wasn't completely done. They still had control over Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America, who were all considered second-tier heroes at the time. Now, obviously, we know that these characters went on to become some of the most popular and important ones in the MCU. But back then, nobody could have predicted that. So after selling off their biggest assets, Marvel just hunkered down and tried to make the best of the situation. They continued publishing comic books and made a few TV shows here and there. But for the most part, they just waited for someone to come along and save them. Little did they know that help was already on the way. The gamble. For years, Marvel tried to make movies based on their characters, but they just couldn't get anyone interested. After all, who would want to watch a movie about a group of unknown heroes? Well, it turns out that the answer is a lot of people. You see, in the early 2000s, there was a superhero movie boom. Movies like Spider-Man, Batman Begins, and X2 proved that people were hungry for more than just big explosions and fancy gadgets. They wanted to see characters that were flawed, relatable, and most importantly, human. And that's exactly what Marvel had to offer. So in 2005, Marvel decided to take a chance and try to make a movie based on one of their lesser-known characters, Iron Man. Now, obviously, we know that this turned out to be a brilliant move. Iron Man not only made almost $600 million at the box office, but it also kicked off the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is the series of interconnected movies that have since become a cultural phenomenon. But at the time, nobody was so sure about this. Iron Man was a relatively unknown character, and it was risky to base an entire movie on him. Plus, the movie had to be perfect. If it flopped, Marvel would be finished. They had nothing left to lose. To make things even more challenging, Marvel needed a lead actor who could bring Iron Man to life. They had a pretty specific vision of what they wanted. On paper, the character was a genius, billionaire, playboy philanthropist. He was also sarcastic, charming, and a bit of a jerk. But what really made Iron Man stand out was his humanity. Underneath all the flashy armor, he was just a regular guy trying to do the right thing. So who could play this complicated, contradictory character? Well, how about Robert Downey Jr.? Now, you might be thinking, who's that? Well, let me tell you, Robert was once one of Hollywood's most promising young actors, starring in movies like Chaplin and Less Than Zero. But in the 90s, he got caught up in substance abuse and spent several years in prison. Since then, he'd been trying to rebuild his career, but he was still considered a risky hire by most studios. But Marvel took a chance on him, and it paid off big time. Robert delivered an Oscar-worthy performance as Tony Stark, capturing both his charm and his vulnerability. And that's why Iron Man became the surprise hit of 2008. Not only did it gross almost $600 million worldwide, but it also introduced the world to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Over the next decade, the MCU would go on to gross over $30 billion at the box office, making it the highest grossing film franchise of all time. This success didn't just make Marvel a ton of money, it also saved the company. After years of financial struggles, Marvel was finally on solid ground. But they knew that they couldn't have done it without Disney. Disney's $4 billion masterstroke. Now, this is where things get interesting. You see, for years, Disney had been known as the family-friendly entertainment company. They produced movies like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and The Jungle Book. They also owned popular channels like ABC, ESPN, and A&E. But in recent years, they've been trying to expand their empire and reach new audiences. That's why in 2009, they decided to buy Marvel for a whopping $4 billion. Now, obviously, this raised a lot of eyebrows. People thought that Disney was overpaying for Marvel and that they wouldn't be able to keep up with their success. But in reality, this was just the beginning. Over the next decade, Disney and Marvel would work together to create some of the most successful movies of all time. The Avengers, Black Panther, Captain Marvel, Infinity War, and Endgame would go on to gross over $30 billion at the box office. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Today, the MCU is a true pop culture phenomenon. It has its own streaming service called Disney Plus, which has over 100 million subscribers. It also has its own theme park attractions, video games, toys, clothing, and so much more. Basically, if you're a fan of Marvel, you can find it pretty much anywhere. And through it all, Stan Lee has remained the beating heart of the MCU. He's made cameos in almost every Marvel movie and has become a beloved figure around the world. Sadly, Stan passed away in 2018, but his legacy lives on in every Marvel story. The future of Marvel. With new heroes like Ms. Marvel, Shang-Chi, Moon Knight, and the X-Men coming to the MCU, it doesn't seem like Marvel is slowing down anytime soon. In fact, the future looks brighter than ever. There are tons of exciting projects in the works, including new movies, new TV shows, and even new theme park attractions. And with Disney Plus, the MCU can be enjoyed in a whole new way. Instead of just watching the movies, fans can now dive deeper into the world of Marvel and explore new characters and storylines. All of this would not have been possible if it was in for the brave gamble that Marvel took all those years ago. They could have easily given up when things got tough, but instead they fought to stay alive. They took risks, they pushed boundaries, and they never gave up on their dream of creating the ultimate superhero universe. And that's why today Marvel is more than just a comic book company. It's a cultural icon. Hit the like, subscribe, share for more. Share for more, stay informed with WhatTV.